evening. I'm Dr. Frances Tony Draper, publisher of the 128-year-old Afro-American newspapers. Welcome to the first ever Word in Black event. With only 13 days away from one of our most pivotal elections in the history of our nation, it is our responsibility as the brands that reflect the voices of our community to speak up and implore each and every one of you to vote with purpose. Now more than ever, it is important for us to come together as a community, along with our allies, to focus on solutions-oriented conversations about bringing an end to systemic racism and racial inequalities. This is a moment in history that could really be a turning point to seeing real social change, but that can only happen if we stay dedicated to voting in the upcoming elections, not just voting for a president and vice president, but voting down the ballot to the local levels of governance. With that being said, let's get an idea of what Word in Black is from some of our publishers in our collaborative.
I call this a special moment in time.
Pivotal moments in history often spark words that inspire change. And I think that this moment that we're in right here, Word in Black, is really a call to action.
When George Floyd was murdered and the news came out about Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, given that we were all stuck in the home and watching the stuff on TV, it just set us off. And I think it was a special moment in time where America, the world, not just Black people, we were paying more attention to the news and how we were being reflected in the news.
Well, the story of Black America has always been told by Black newspapers, but in the wake of George Floyd and the unrest that has gone on all across the United States, the presidential election going on, voter disenfranchisement, and the myriad other different things that are going on to Black people across this country, the need became ever more present, and our stories need to get out more and more.
The Word in Black collaborative, really was sparked out of the movement and the moment that we're in.
What makes Word in Black so unique is that it is a coming together of Black newspapers, businesses that are primarily, or at least had our start primarily as print products. And so we're unique in that way.
This idea came about where it said, well, why don't we have these 10 leading publishers come together so that we can elevate some of these issues to the forefront of attention, not only just locally, but from a national perspective, and give it a national platform.
It really was born out of, similarly as the start of the Black press was, that others wouldn't speak for us. And so 10 papers, 10 Black newspapers across the country, some of our most innovative and creative Black newspapers across the country came together to address these disparities in a different kind of way, in a 21st century kind of way.
I believe that our publications have a unique responsibility and are positioned uniquely to share with the world what all of this means and how to translate all of it.
A lot of times when we see coverage in the news, it tells us the facts, the who, what, where, when, and why. And that's important to have the facts, but it's more that we need to know. We don't just need to know what's wrong, what the problems are. We know that there are problems in America, and there's problems specific to Black Americans, but we need solutions.
We are working to not only tell the stories, but to help people find ways to make a difference in their own lives and in the lives of people around them.
Where we're actually speaking truth to power, but we're also telling what our reality is, regardless of what city it is.
I believe that there's a new awareness about the Black press and how we bring a unique message, not only to Black people, but people who are trying to better understand the Black community. The best is yet to come for the Black press.
Hi, I'm Chris Bennett, publisher of the Seattle Medium. It is very important to us as publishers, advocates, and trusted stewards in the African American community to host this virtual event prior to the election, because traditional broadcasts do not have enough time to take us through the historical context of what we are seeing today when it comes to the critical issue of voting. Voter suppression has been an ongoing battle since African Americans were first given the right to vote up until today. So let's take a quick look at the history of voter suppression in America.
The voting process should not be should not be political or partisan, whether you're on the left, the right, or in the middle.
We recognize that voter suppression is a major problem that continues to raise its ugly head in communities all across our country. A lot of people don't know what it looks like. It was a good question that you asked me. What does it look like?
There are some systemic things that we are constantly fighting against, and it's important that we educate our people and our community about what those systemic things are.
Black newspapers have always really had a very important role in getting people to the polls. And this is like no other election that we have seen. And getting people out there to vote is so incredibly important.
The Word in Black collaboration, the group is taking on the task of voter suppression as a topic to explore and to speak to, because obviously from the historic perspective of the African American community, voter suppression has been there since the initial "you get the right to vote."
We had in 1870 we had the 17th Amendment that gave blacks the right to vote. And so for a brief period of time, you saw blacks elect to public office and register to vote. That was short-lived, responded to, there was a huge pushback there, and that it took on even violent components in denying blacks the access to the polls.
I mean, all the way back to Frederick Douglass and then Ida B. Wells, and what that really meant as a voice of, people are literally being killed in the streets, in the forests, in the fields, and nothing is being done, nothing is being said. And these were the people who shed light on that.
Is a situation that is probably going to continue throughout our lifetime, and actually started way before. My mother often speaks of the fact of her father trying to vote and them asking how many jelly beans were in a jar. So I think they're using different techniques today to do that, like eliminating voting districts or voting locations. They've actually switched about 91 of them for the upcoming election. Some of that is going to be attributed to the fact that churches and some schools don't feel safe allowing people to come in to vote during this cycle. But the fact is they've got to find a way that people have the right and ability to be able to vote so that we can eliminate voter suppression.
When you grow up in a community, you pretty much get a sense of what the voting locations are if you're from that community. And when those locations begin to change frequently, it's really a systemic issue that says, we really don't want you to find them. We hope that you're not motivated enough.
Working with a purpose is understanding your interests, where your interests lie, and I think that should be the determinant of how you use the franchise, how you, first of all, will encourage your community to recognize where their interests lie and to vote on behalf of your interests.
Word in Black is so critical because it now gives the 10 newspapers that are involved in the project right now an opportunity to share our versions of how voter suppression takes place in each one of our cities. And it's important for our readers to know what's happening across the country as it's being reported in Black-owned newspapers.
Why vote? 18 and 40-year-olds? There's more access to college money, and if you're on the other end, it may reduce and forgive your college debt. Or you may be able to get more job opportunities. Or the fact of the matter is, you're the one who's going to be stuck with the climate change results. For 40 and 60-year-olds, why vote? It determines your taxes, your family deductions, better pay, quality of education of your children, and better health care. And for the 60-plussers, Social Security, age discrimination, a better world for your grandchildren, and better health care. If you are waiting on change or some great leader, stop. You are the change we're waiting on. Go vote.
So from the inaugural event that we're having tonight, What I'm really hoping is that the audience who we reach on tonight will be better informed, more informed about this election process and how it works.
Good evening. I'm Eleanor Tatum, publisher and editor-in-chief of the New York Amsterdam News.
And I'm Larry Lee, president and publisher of the Sacramento Observer newspaper. And welcome to our inaugural Word in Black virtual event. Word in Black is a collaborative of 10 of the nation's leading Black-owned newspaper publishers, created in partnership with the local media association. The LMA is a thriving and innovative organization that brings together more than 3,000 media outlets and research development partners with the focus on reinventing business models for the news industry. We're very excited to launch our collaborative tonight.
We have witnessed various forms of voter suppression unfolding around the nation. Just this past Sunday, a ballot box was set on fire in the predominantly Black neighborhood of Baldwin Park in Los Angeles, California. Last week, many early voters throughout the South faced waiting in line for over 9 hours due to closures of several polling stations.
Without a doubt, this election process has become one that is unprecedented. So what does that mean for all of us?
Over the course of the next two panels this evening, we are honored to have a group of esteemed leaders who can help us make sense of this moment while giving us some insights as to how we can vote with purpose and discuss how we can work towards a safe and just elections process for all of us.
We want this conversation to be interactive with our viewers. So if you're joining us on Facebook and on YouTube, you can get out your phones and participate by going to wordinblack.com/vote to participate in our live polls.
Our first poll is now live. Have you personally experienced efforts to discourage you from voting? Vote now and we'll check in on our results a bit later.
All right, so let's get to our panelists. For our first panel, please welcome Susan Smith Richardson, who's the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity, a nonprofit, nonpartisan investigative news organization. Thank you, Susan, for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
We also have Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Clark leads one of the country's most important national civil rights organizations in the pursuit of equal justice for all. Thank you, Kristen, for being here as well.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure to next introduce Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who is a syndicated columnist, author, and president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, also known as the Black Press of America. Thank you, Dr. Chavis, for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be a part of this very important discussion.
Last but certainly not least on our first panel is we welcome Wes Moore, who is a best-selling author, a combat veteran, social entrepreneur, and the CEO of Robinhood. Thank you, Wes, for joining us tonight as well.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, everyone. So there's a lot to get into this evening. Kristen, let's start with you if you can. You have been really busy over the last few months. New tactics of voter suppression. What sort of new tactics of voter suppression are you seeing? And what is your organization doing to help preserve the voting rights for people?
Well, no doubt the 2020 election season is an unprecedented one. It's a year in which we started off seeing widespread voter suppression efforts in the form of purging of the voter rolls, shuttering of polling sites in Black communities, efforts to make it harder for people to register to vote. And that picture has only been compounded in the wake of a pandemic, a public health crisis that has had a particularly stark impact on Black people and other people of color. What that has resulted in is a very messy picture across the country. We have 50 states that have all been struggling to figure out how to properly conduct an election in the wake of the pandemic. And some states have been successful in actually acknowledging the impact of the pandemic, responding to it, lifting barriers that voters face. But then there are those states with very dark and egregious histories of voting discrimination that have dug their heels in at every turn. Texas is one state, by way of example, where it is incredibly difficult to vote during the pandemic. And I would dare say Texas is just about the hardest place to vote right now in our country. And that's because you have the combination of election officials who have been hostile. They have resisted opening up access to vote by mail. And then some of the victories secured in court have been reversed by an increasingly hostile appellate court, the Fifth Circuit in particular, which has only become more resistant to voting rights under President Trump. Right now, we are seeing voter suppression rear its head in efforts to limit access to vote by mail, efforts to not provide notice to voters when states identify minor issues with absentee ballots, notice and an opportunity to cure. In the state of Tennessee, it is actually a crime to distribute absentee ballot applications. So we have been fighting tooth and nail against some of these barriers that voters are up against, because we know that these are barriers that are particularly standing in the way of Black voters seeking to exercise a voice in our democracy right now. We have filed close to 36 lawsuits since the pandemic, and we've also worked to expand the size of our network of legal volunteers to contend with the challenges that voters face. We've grown that network from 5,000 legal volunteers to 23,000 this season, which really just speaks to the gravity of challenges that voters are up against. I'll close by noting that we run a program at the Lawyers Committee called Election Protection. This is the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program, anchored by the 866 Our Vote hotline. And we're working 7 days a week to troubleshoot and resolve the problems that voters face. My very final point here is that all of this is happening in the midst of a historic nomination for a vacancy on our Supreme Court, one that is moving forward at lightning speed, and one that should not be moving forward as American voters across our country are casting ballots. This has been the most politicized Supreme Court nomination in our country's history. And at the heart of it is a nominee whose record on voting rights is astounding. During 3 days of testimony, Judge Barrett refused to acknowledge that voter intimidation is illegal. She refused to acknowledge that voting discrimination is ongoing. And I think all of this signals the potential for serious rollbacks when it comes to safeguarding voting rights for Black people in our country if she is thrown.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen. That's a lot of work that you have been doing, and a lot of work that it looks like you're going to continue to have to do. And, 36 lawsuits that you're currently working on, and it looks like there are more in the future if what looks like it's going to happen actually does happen with this next Supreme Court justice. Next we're going to go to Susan. Susan, what aren't we seeing in the news as it relates to the severity of how our voting rights are being threatened?
Thanks for that question, Eleanor. I think there's a tremendous amount of work going on across the country right now because folks are very much thoughtful of this moment. But I want to step back and talk about something that I think is really critical to have to the coverage that we need more of. We are in a moment, as Kristen just eloquently stated, we have a convergence of issues. COVID, a very active campaign to stop people from voting. But there's also a larger bridge that I don't think we need to lose sight of, and that's the question of history. Historically, the vote in this country has been a contested process. This is not something that is just developed in this moment or over the last 5 years. We could say it is a project that goes all the way back to 1789 and the first US Constitution. So I think one thing that is really important to bring into the coverage of the moment is a historical perspective about the contested nature of the vote in this country historically, and who has and has not been able to vote, and the efforts over the decades to be able to bring folks into the ballot box. That's an important point of history that we can't forget as we put what's happening today in context. The second piece I want to talk about is really the importance of having benchmarks. We're in a moment right now in which, one of the ways that people are being left out of the ability to vote is through what we're seeing with polling place closures and change of locations. This is a critical way in which people are being disenfranchised, but when we really pull back to look at it, we need benchmarks to be able to not just address the moment, but to look forward to begin to address, and this is what journalism can do well, is address how we can begin to look at the impact of the closures that we've seen since 2012. One of the projects we did at the Center for Public Integrity was to go back using the frame of the Supreme Court changes, dilution of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. That was our big frame. What we did was go back and look at changes in polling place locations since 2012 in general elections. We looked at 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. So we get a sense of what has happened in terms of people's access, ease of access to the vote since the Supreme Court decision that diluted provisions of the Voting Rights Act that made it such that local jurisdictions did not have to go through in 9 states and 6 others in part, didn't have to go through federal officials to clear their election plans. If you set these benchmarks and you go back and you look at what has happened in elections since then and look at the changes in polling place locations, you can clearly begin to understand and see how targeted efforts have made it such that people are not able to exercise their right to vote. So setting benchmarks and looking at what has happened over time, I think is one way to begin to be moving forward, address what needs to happen in order to make sure that what aspect of systems are working for people to be able to vote. I want to be really, really clear here that in this period, something that journalists really, should always do but must do now, we go out, we report stories, we tell stories, and hopefully we do them with accuracy, authenticity, context, and a sense of historical perspective. But the other part of the work that we're seeing is increasingly critical now is also sharing data that tells stories, but also data that could be shared on a county by county basis in states across the country, so people can use that information, individual voters, civic organizations, to begin to invest in and equip themselves to work in their own self-interest. So one of the things that we've done with this project is not just tell stories based on data, but put together the first national data set of polling place closures and changes in federal elections. And we really think this is important information that people can use in deciding and looking at what's happening in their community, whether you're, Harris County, which is where half of my family is in Texas, or you are in, Chicago, where I lived for years. Being able to share information with people so they can use that to act on determining their own civic participation is really, really critical. So I think that's where we are now in terms of journalism, really thinking not just about telling the stories, but being able to provide data to people that they can use to make decisions and act on their own lives.
That's really helpful. Susan, I think that you bring up a tremendous point in regards to particularly bringing in context of this. This is not a new challenge that we've been facing for generations. But as many of us have said, we're facing an election that can ultimately change the course of our lives and our children's lives. Wes, I'd like to come to you next. What is your advice to African-American voters who are still on the fence to thinking about voting and voting with a purpose?
It's there's no doubt that this election is not even that it can ultimately change the course of our lives. It will. What happens on November 3rd will change the course of our life. Period. And the fact that we even have this the fact that we have to have this conversation virtually says enough. Elections matter. Who sit in these seats, it matters. And I think about this in context of, there is no greater power that we have right now to express our wills and our interests and our hopes and our aspirations as a people than what we are going to see November 3rd, because the reality is, if we turn out, we will win. This election will be turned out. This election will be determined and will be won based on our ability to go out there and make our voices heard. If we make our voices heard, the election will be fine. If we don't, that's when this thing becomes incredibly tenuous and incredibly complicated. And I think about this in three different refrains. It's one, it's understanding how much had to be done in order for us to even be at this point, and how people had to sacrifice and work and give everything in order for us to have this opportunity. The second is the people who are on the ground actively fighting right now to make sure that the right that has been hard-earned, our right to have a vote, our right to have a voice, is being protected and not suppressed, which there are active forces doing so. And I'm thinking about the work of, the remarkable work of two of the fellow panelists, whether it be Susan and Kristen, who every day are fighting to make sure that your earned right to vote is protected and that will be counted. And the third thing, I think, is it is a really important point to think about those who you're voting on behalf of. I'm very clear, I'm voting on behalf of not just myself, I'm voting on behalf of my 9-year-old daughter. I'm voting on behalf of my 6-year-old son. I'm voting on their behalf. They will not have the chance to walk into a ballot box and making sure that their future is protected. That's my job. That's my job. That's all of our job come November 3rd, to make sure that their voices are heard and their futures are protected. So when you think about it in context of what this means for all of us, for the fact that we have people who literally sacrificed everything in order for us to have a vote, that there were people who fought and bled and died in order for us to have a voice, that there were people who met down and faced down some of the most horrific and tragic circumstances that this country has ever put on anybody, and still never had a chance to cast a ballot. When I think about the fact that there are people who are waking up every single day, who are fighting the good fights, who are preparing, whether it be legal challenges or operational challenges, to make sure that people have a safe and an effective way to make sure their voices are heard, or whether it is our children who are asking us and hoping that we can make sure that we are doing our part to protect their future. This election won't just possibly change our world, it will. And so it really does become our responsibility to answer that question of how will it change? And will we be heard in it? Will we stand up? Will we be courageous? And will we do our part? Because I can tell you right now, if we do, we'll be okay. If we don't, and we allow those other forces to win, then the reality is everything then goes up in the air. And that's our responsibility, to actually be able to control our own destiny.
Wow. Thank you so much, Wes. I really, really appreciate the words that you've just shared with us. And, that leads perfectly into our next panelist, Dr. Ben Chavis. He leads the NMPA, and the credo of the Black press is, for too long have others spoken for us. We choose to plead our own cause. And Dr. Chavis, our question for you is, what has the role significantly been within the Black press in fighting voter suppression?
Thank you, Eleanor. I believe that the Black press, as the voice of Black America, we not only report the news, but we also have to be an advocate for freedom, justice, and equality. 2020 marks the 193rd year of the Black press in America. Since 1827, when Freedom's Journal was first published in New York, the black press has been on the front line, fighting to get the right to vote, fighting against voter suppression, reminding our people. I think it's not only about our rights to vote, it's our responsibility to vote. As the other panelists have detailed, this has been a struggle, not just in 2020, but for decades, for centuries. There's been a lot of sacrifice. Voting for us is sacred. It's a sacred responsibility to go out and vote. And we all agree that this is the most consequential election in our lifetime. From a black press perspective, the antidote to voter suppression is massive voter turnout, massive black voter turnout. You know, we cannot allow the antics at some of these states and some of these counties, like in Texas, to try to discourage, dissuade, and even prevent people from voting. That has to be overwritten. We've always had these challenges, not as severe as they are today because we're in the middle of a pandemic. But I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing from, we have 230 African-American owned newspapers that are part of the National Trade Association of the NMPA. And what I'm hearing from the West Coast, the East Coast, the North and the South and the Midwest, there are not only long lines, already people voting for early voting, but people plan. This is going to be a massive voter turnout. I'm hoping that we have the largest black voter turnout in American history as we approach November the 3rd. And then, of course, working with Christian and Susan and others, Wes and others, we have to now protect that vote because there will be, I don't trust some of these people that are in charge of voting apparatus. So we have to make sure that our votes are not only counted, but our votes are respected. Again, from the black press, yes, the census will also have been somewhat undercounted in this latest census because they cut off the census early during the pandemic. But there are around 50 million African Americans. And all of our brothers and sisters who are eligible to vote, there should be no excuse. Everybody should be out voting. And so that our votes can be counted and the votes can be impacted. I'm actually optimistic. I'm not pessimistic because I think some of these voter suppression tactics, Eleanor, have served as a modus, has given people new energy. There wouldn't be voter suppression if our vote was not important. The reason why people are going to great lengths to suppress the vote is because of the important and the potential impact of our vote. And so all of the people who are listening and viewing this panel discussion tonight, I hope you will go out and have a record voter turnout in general, but particularly the black vote. The black vote is key to who will be the next president, who will be the next vice president, who will go to the Senate, who will go to the members of Congress. It's just not at the top of the ballot, it's the downline offices that are also at stake in every state. So we must not only encourage our readers, people read our newspapers, go to our online edition, those who are impacted by our social media channels, but we have to remind people of our responsibility to vote. So yes, the black press, we report on these instances of voter suppression, but we also report from an advocacy perspective in our editorial pages and our voice. We say we're the voice of Black America. So yes, the black press matters, black votes matter, black lives matter.
Here we go. Well said, Dr. Chavis. Let's quickly go to the poll just to kind of get a sense of our audience. Again, the poll question was, have you personally experienced efforts to discourage you from voting? 35% of our audience said yes, I got it, but I still voted. Persistent crew. 56% said no, they have not experienced voter suppression. And then 8%, almost 10% of our audience said it worked and it kept them from voting. We know that this is I'll throw this out to the group. We know voting suppression isn't new, but what are some of the ways historically that the black vote has been suppressed? And are some of our audience, are they not recognizing maybe ways that they've been suppressed in the past?
Well, I think that, something that Susan said, I just want to repeat, our history is very important, but we should learn from our history. We don't necessarily have to repeat the history, we should learn from it. And every instance where there have been these tactics, these antics. I mean, we could take up the whole program just listing all the diverse, nefarious, and sometimes most illegal devices that have been put in place to keep us from voting, to deny the vote, and to scare people away from voting. It's kind of sad to hear that 8% of the people who responded to the poll didn't vote because of voter suppression. If they're listening tonight, they need to go back and override that. There should be no percent of our people that allow voter suppression to work.
Yeah, well, this conversation couldn't be more timely. Kristen, Wes, Susan, Dr. Chavis, thank you so much for the time that you've given us today, your expertise and helping us bring our Word in Black virtual event to life. Please make sure to follow our guests on their social media channels, and let's continue the conversation by using #WordInBlackVote on Twitter. As we prepare for our second panel, let's hear more from our publishers.
Thank you. You guys were great.
Thank you.
I wish it was an hour long.
We could do 2 hours on this.
We sure could.
Yes.
That number got me too. That 8%
Yeah.
said it stopped them from voting already.
That's too high. That's too high.
Before the end of slavery. It's one of the most important institutions that exists in the Black community. For nearly 200 years, we have not only chronicled our experiences, but we have also inspired greatness within our communities. This moment requires greatness from our publications, as the disparities and injustices are now a matter of life and death. Black lives have always mattered to us. Our publications matter to Blacks. We hope that matters to you too.
Reimagining the Black press is one of the most important things we can do at this critical moment in time. Our voices have never been more important and more needed. We need significant funding to put traditional Black publishers on the path to sustainability while funding startups that will serve more communities of color.
It is essential for the survival and sustainability of Black-owned print media and their journalists that they rapidly submerge themselves in digital transformation to remain relevant sources of news.
For us, about us, and by us, the Black press has been a trusted source, serving as the advocate and historian of the advances and challenges the Black community has confronted. From slavery, Harlem Renaissance, lynching, civil rights movement, health disparities, education inequities, environmental racism, criminal injustice, police killings, and more. Because we have shared these experiences, the Fund for Black Journalism will provide resources to expand solution journalism and our mission to improve the quality of life for all.
Event. That was such a powerful first panel, and we're going to continue to do some more. So now that we have some more context into the history of voter suppression and the challenges that we're facing, let's focus on ensuring that our voices are being heard. Again, if you're joining us on Facebook and YouTube, you can get out your phones and participate in our next poll by going to wordinblack.com/vote. Or if you're watching on one of our partner sites, you can click right on the poll to cast your vote. With all the information that you've heard this evening, we'd love to know, how are you voting this year? Go ahead and vote now, and we'll see how votes are being cast a little bit later on.
We are so honored to welcome our next panel of guests. Bakari T. Sellers is an attorney, political commentator, politician, and author. So happy to have you join our conversation, Bakari.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Next, please also welcome Lee M. Chapman, who is the director of the Voting Rights Program, which oversees projects that can advocate for voting protections for marginalized people. Thank you for joining us, Lee.
Thanks for having me here tonight.
And also please welcome Nolan Williams Jr., an American composer, producer, music director, innovator, curator, and musicologist. Welcome, Nolan.
Thanks so much for having me, Eleanor and Larry. Glad to be here.
So Bakari, let's start with you. How concerned are you that the voter suppression will impact this year's election?
That's a good question. How concerned am I? I'm concerned greatly. I think that Wes and Dr. Ben and many others in the panel before, you had brilliant minds on that panel. They all have properly threatened me about the impact of voter suppression on this election. And so what I say is that we have serious disinformation, misinformation campaigns. We have individuals who are hearkening back to the days of of Lester Maddox and George Wallace, even not that long ago with Scott Walker. And so when you have these obstacles to voting, we just saw Jonte Austin, who is a world famous music producer down in Atlanta, Georgia, wait in line 11 hours. This voter suppression is real. But I will tell you this, that until we begin to message to Black voters and spend money with Black media and articulate messages that resonate with Black voters, because this election is not just between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, it's between Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and the couch. And until we start giving people a reason to come out of their house, voter suppression or not, which is a huge issue, we're not going to have the turnout that we want. And so, that's my beginning. I think that, the turnout we've seen is just astronomical. It's beautiful to watch. But we have a long way to go when it comes to talking to Black people and talking to Black voters.
Thank you, Bakari. There is still a lot of work to be done, and getting people to the polls is just part of it. Making sure that they can get to the polls and making sure that they are safe getting to them is just part of it. So next, we're going to go to Lee. What are the most critical voter suppression efforts happening right now in communities across the country?
Sure. So I'm Lee Chapman. I'm the director of the Voting Rights Program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We're the nation's largest and oldest civil rights coalition, and we have a diverse membership of over 220 organizations. Election season is underway, and it really is unprecedented times. This is the second presidential election without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. Over 220,000 people have passed away because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as Kristen said, we have a vacancy on the Supreme Court. And on top of all of this, voter suppression continues to persist in our country amid calls for voter intimidation and violence at polling places across the country from the President of the United States. Voters in states like Georgia and North Carolina have been standing in hours-long lines during early voting. Online voter registration systems have crashed in some states, like Florida and Virginia, which has created confusion. And there have actually been over 300 lawsuits filed this election cycle. It's the most we've ever seen in any election cycle. And with all of these last-minute decisions and changes to rules, voters are really at higher risk of being disenfranchised this year. A few weeks ago, the Supreme Court reinstated South Carolina's requirement that absentee ballots include witness signatures. And in Texas, a federal appeals court just ruled that only one drop box would be available per county for voters to return their absentee ballots. And some Texas counties are over 2,000 miles long. So this decision would disproportionately impact low-income voters, voters with disabilities, older voters, and voters of color. But all the news isn't bad. As we mentioned, there is record voter turnout. I check the voter turnout numbers multiple times a day, and Right now, more than 35 million Americans have already voted, which really compares to a little over 1 million voters this time 4 years ago. So right now, with 14 days to go to the end of the election, we've mentioned this before, the best counter to voter suppression is massive voter turnout. So the Leadership Conference and our coalition, we're doing everything we can over the next 14 days to really emphasize that people need to make a plan to vote in the way that makes them feel the most safe, whether that's by mail, whether that's putting on a mask and voting in person early or on election day.
Very powerful. Great information, Lee. Thank you. So we'll go next to Nolan. You've been very creative in your approach to sharing messages with our community about the importance of civic engagement. What is your message that you try to share with our community about participating in the voting with a purpose, and especially up and down the ballot from national to the local level?
Well, again, thank you for having me. The message is pretty simple, that we have not only a right, but a responsibility to vote. And so I want to echo Dr. Chavis's words from earlier, but it's also to leverage what we have to make an impact. And that's really what I set out to do, working with my business partner, Dale Mott. We produced a video of my voting rights anthem called I Have a Right to Vote. And we did it because we recognized that this was an anthem for our time, that it could be used to help energize and educate people around this election. And we wanted to get this message out that regardless of voter suppression tactics, that we should not allow anything or anyone to impede us from exercising a right that has been so long and so hard fought for. And as we go into this cycle of the election, we want people to know that it is important that we make sure that every vote and every voter counts. But even beyond that, in leveraging the power of what's in our hands, to recognize that we have to vote for this election, during this election, but then beyond that, we need more persons to leverage platforms and networks to bring about and to address social change. And that's the work that I've been about for over 30 years as a composer and cultural curator, and that's what inspired me to write this song and what inspired me to put out this video. We need more people to take on the responsibility that all of us have to perfect this union.
Thank you so much, Nolan. When we look at your video, it empowers people to do something. So thank you. It tells people to have their voices heard by voting. And now there are many different ways people can go and vote. And as Lee said a few minutes ago, 35 million people have voted early this year versus 1 million 4 years ago. We have a poll, Larry, don't we?
We do. We do have a poll. Everyone has been going through the poll. And again, thank you all for participating in the poll. The question was, how are you planning to vote this year? About 20% of our audience says at the polls. 36% said by mail. And early voting is 44%. So to Lee's point, a majority, almost 80% of our audience is doing something early. Lee, let's come back to you. So, we recognize that this is an important election. We saw in the earlier panel, it seemed like about almost 10%, 8% of our viewing audience had been discouraged by voter suppression efforts and ended up not voting. Why are people voting so early from your perspective? Give us some context.
Yeah, I think with the pandemic, one good thing that we have seen is that states have increased the options for people to vote. Now people have expanded vote by mail. There's expanded early voting. People can choose to vote on election day if they want to. And it's actually really critical that people cast their vote early, because if there's any issues with their vote by mail ballot, for example, there's time for them to cure and fix their ballot if there are errors. So we are really encouraging people to vote as early as they can. But I think people are also voting early because there's so much at stake in this election, from From trying to fight police brutality to making sure that we have a healthcare system that works for everybody. People know that what's at stake, and they're energized, and they want to turn out and have their voice heard.
Yeah, Bakari, what about you? What's your perspective in that regard?
So I actually agree with Lee to a great extent, a great degree. But I just think the people are kind of fed up. I mean, I don't know if anybody's quoted Fannie Lou Hamer yet, but we might as well throw it out there. People are tired of being sick and tired. And when you have 220,000 people who have died, and you have millions who've contracted the virus, the overwhelming majority have been Black and brown. A statistic that I saw today, which blew my mind, because I'm somebody who says young people don't vote. I've been that person. And trying to age them and encourage them and like, look, y'all, 18 to 30 early voters are up 8.5%, 8.5% over 16 and 18. And so there's so many people who are coming out who are waiting in these long lines. You know, I am very happy about how far we've come, but again, we still have so far to go. And, you know, what's the impetus behind people turning out in numbers like this? I just think that everything that's going on, people want to be a part of what's not a moment, but a movement. And so we're seeing that in the polling.
Well, you know, Bakari, Lee, and Nolan, on behalf of all of the publishers in the Word in Black Collaborative, thank you for bringing our vision to life with your presence and expertise. We can't thank you enough, and all the other panelists for being with us tonight. Let's continue the conversation by using the hashtag WordInBlackVote on Twitter.
Yeah, we could do this for hours, but we're limited by time. But we thank you all for participating in our Word in Black virtual event. Word in Black is a collaborative made up of 10 of the nation's leading Black-owned newspapers. Among them are the Atlanta Voice, the Afro-American newspaper, the Seattle Medium, the Houston Defender, the Michigan Chronicle, the New York Amsterdam News, the Washington Informer, the St. Louis American, the Dallas Weekly, and the Sacramento Observer.
Word in Black would not exist without the donations from over 200 individuals, foundations, and corporations. Thank you to all of our donors, funders, and supporters. And for more information, you can get involved. Go to wordinblack.com.
Of course, we want to again thank all of our panelists. You are fantastic. We also, an event like this couldn't be done without the team behind the screen. So we'd like to make a special salute to Mike McKinnon and the rest of the team at Megaphone TV for providing our platform for tonight. And also a very, very big thank you to Nancy, Julia, Steve, Emily, and the entire Local Media Association team, as well as to our producers, Zinga Blake and Eric Nievarowski.
I'm Eleanor Tatum.
And I'm Larry Lee. Thank you all so much for joining us. And if you haven't yet, go and vote with a purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Don't forget to vote.